Johannesburg and Pretoria in 1896, little white mice of chance, coats of wool and corduroy pants, gold and wine, women and sin, I'll give to you, if you let me into the glittering house of chance. American Dice Incantation. At Johannesburg we were the guests of Mr. Abe Bailey at Kluwer Lodge. Our host, however, was unfortunately absent, detained in the precincts of the jail at Pretoria, although allowed out on bail. In the same house he had entertained in 1891 my brother Randolph Nine, and his friend Captain G. Williams, Royal Horse Guards, on their way to Mashonaland. One of my first visitors was another fellow traveller of theirs, Mr. H. C. Perkins, the celebrated American mining expert. This gentleman was a great friend of Randolph's, and he spoke most touchingly of his great attachment to the latter, and of his grief at his death. For 5 years Mr. and Mrs. Perkins had lived in Johannesburg, where they both enjoyed universal respect, and their approaching departure, to settle once more in America, was deplored by all. Considered to be the highest mining expert of the day, Mr. Perkins had seen the rise of the Rand since its infancy, and he had been shrewd enough to keep out of the late agitation and its disturbances. Under his guidance we saw the sights of the towns, the far-famed Rand Club, the market square crammed, almost for the first time since the so-called Revolution, with trek wagons and their boar drivers, the much-talked-of gold fields, offices, barred and barricaded, which had been the headquarters of the Reform Committee, the Standard Bank where the smuggled arms had been kept, and finally the exchange and the street enclosed by iron chains, where the stock markets were principally carried on. We were also shown the interior of the stock exchange itself, though we were warned that it was scarcely worth a visit at that time of depression. We heard the call of the shares, which operation only took 20 minutes, against nearly 2 hours during the time of the recent boom. Instead of the listless, bored-looking individuals below us, who only assumed a little excitement when the revolving, clock-like machine denoted any popular share, we were told that a few months ago every available space had been crowded by excited buyers and sellers, some without hats, others in their shirt sleeves, almost knocking one another over in their desire to do business. Those must indeed have been palmy days, when the money so lightly made was correspondingly lightly spent, when champagne replaced the usual whiskey split at the Rand Club, and on all sides was to be heard the old and well-known formula, "Here's luck," as the successful speculator toasted an old friend or a newcomer. However, to return to Johannesburg as we found it, after the 1895 boom. Even then it seemed to me that for the first time in South Africa I saw life. Cape Town, with its pathetic dullness and palpable efforts to keep up a show of business. Kimberley, with its deadly respectability, both paled in interest beside their younger sister, so light-hearted, reckless and enterprising. Before long, in spite of gloomy reflections on the evils of gold-seeking, I fell under the fascination of what was then a wonderful town, especially wonderful from its youth. The ever-moving crowds which thronged the streets, every man of which appeared to be full of important business, and in a desperate hurry, reminded one of the city in London. Smart carriages with well-dressed ladies drove rapidly past, the shops were cunningly arranged with tempting wares, and all this bustle and traffic was restored in little over a week. A fortnight previously a revolution was impending, and a siege was looming ahead. Business had been at a complete standstill, the shops and houses barred and barricaded, and many of the inhabitants were taking a hurried departure, while bitterness, discord and racial feeling were rampant. Now, after a few days, that cosmopolitan and rapidly changing population appeared to have buried their differences, and the uninitiated would never have guessed the town had passed, and was, indeed, still passing through troublous times. Mr. Perkins, however, was pessimistic, and told us appearances were misleading. He rightly foresaw many lean years for those interested in the immediate future of the Rand, though even he, perhaps, hardly realized how lean those would become. Since those days much water has flown under the bridge, and the trade of the town, not to speak of the mining industry, has gone from bad to worse. Recently Federation, the dream of many a statesman connected with South Africa, has opened a new vista of political peace and prosperity to its chastened citizens. Many of these, in affluent circumstances in 1896, have since gone under financially. But some of the original inhabitants still remain to show in the future that they have learned wisdom from their past troubles, brought on principally by their mad haste to get rich too quickly. During our stay at Johannesburg, we made an expedition to Pretoria in order to see our host and other friends, who were still on bail there, awaiting their trial, and also to visit the seat of the Boer government. By these remarkable state railways, the short journey of 32 miles occupied 3 hours. We passed one very large Boer lager, or military camp on the line, which looked imposing enough in the bright sunlight, with its shining array of white tarpaulin-covered wagons. Companies of mounted burghers, armed to the teeth, and sitting their ragged but well-bred ponies as if glued to the saddle, were to be seen galloping to and fro. Although the teeth of the enemy had been drawn for the present, the Boers were evidently determined to keep up a martial display. As Pretoria was approached, the country became very pretty. Low hills and many trees, including lovely weeping willows, appeared on the landscape, and away towards the horizon was situated many a snug little farm. Running streams caught the rays of the sun, and really rich herbage supplied the pasture for herds of fat cattle. The town itself did not prove specially interesting. An imposing space called Church Square was pointed out to us with great pride by the Dutch gentleman who kindly did chicharoni. There we saw the little primitive, dopper, church where the President always worshipped, overshadowed and dwarfed by the magnificent Houses of Parliament, built since the Transvaal acquired riches, and by the no less grand government offices. As we were standing before the latter, after the fashion of tourists, our guide suddenly became very excited, and told us we were really in good luck, for the President was just about to leave his office on his return home for his midday meal. In a few minutes the old gentleman emerged, guarded by 4 armed burghers, and passed rapidly into his carriage. We took a good look at this remarkable personage. Stout in figure, with a venerable white beard, in a somewhat worn frock coat and a rusty old black silk hat, President Kruger did not look the stern dictator of his little kingdom, which in truth he was. Our Dutch friend told us Oom Paul was in the habit of commencing work at 5 a.m, and that he transacted business, either at his house or in the government offices, with short intermissions, until 5 p.m. Simply worshipped by his burghers, he was on a small scale, and in his ignorant fashion, a man of iron like Bismarck, notably in his strong will and in the way in which he imposed the same on his countrymen. The extent of his personal influence could be gauged when one considered that his mere orders had restrained his undisciplined soldier burghers, who, irritated by being called away from their peaceful existences, maddened by the loss of some of their number who fell in the fighting, and elated by their easy victory, were thirsting to shoot down the leaders of the raid, as they stood in the market square at Krugersdorp. The state of the Boer government at that time added to the President's difficulties. He was hampered by the narrowest-minded Volksraad Parliament, imaginable, who resented tooth and nail even the most necessary concessions to the Uitlanders. He was surrounded by corrupt officials, most of whom were said to be implicated in the late rebellion. He was the head of a community which was known to be split up into several sections, owing to acute religious disputes. And yet he contrived, at 71 years of age, to outwit the 60,000 Uitlanders at Johannesburg, and to present his rotten republic as a model of all that was excellent and high-minded to the world at large. At the same time, he compelled his burghers to forget their own differences, as they hurled defiance at the common foe. It seems to be a truism that it requires a Boer to rule a Boer, and in some ways the mantle of President Kruger would appear to have descended in our days upon General Louis Botha. According to all accounts, his will is now law to the ignorant backveld Boers, although his guiding principles savour more of the big stick than of the spoon-feeding system. Undoubtedly loyal to England, he bids fair in the future to help found a nation, based upon the union of British and Boer, inheriting their traditions, cultivating their ideals and pursuing their common ends. But this utopia seemed far away in 1896, and it was, alas, destined that many lives should be laid down and much treasure expended before its advent. For the moment lamentations were rife in Johannesburg, and at many a dinner party, unprofitable discussions raged as to what would have happened had Dr. Jameson entered the city. On this point no one could agree. Some people said the town could have been starved out in a few days, and the water supply cut off immediately. Others asserted that the Boers were in reality overawed by Dr. Jameson's name and prestige, and would have been glad to make terms. The practical spirits opined that the only thing which would have saved the inhabitants in any case was the tame ending which actually came about, namely, the High Commissioner's intervention coupled with President Kruger's moderation and wisdom in allowing England to punish her own irregular soldiers. The more one heard of the whole affair, the more it seemed to resemble a scene out of a comic opera. The only people at Johannesburg who had derived any advantage from the confusion were several hitherto unknown military commanders who had proudly acquired the title of colonel and had promptly named a body of horse after themselves. During the days before the final fiasco, these leaders used to make short detours round the town in full regimentals and finally fill up the time by being photographed in groups. Mercifully, as it turned out, they were not ready for active service when Dr. Jameson was reported at Krugerstorp. We made an excursion to the so-called battlefield before leaving for the south. We started in a covered wagonette with no springs to speak of, drawn by 6 mules and a pair of horses as leaders. 2 Kaffirs acted as charioteers and kept up an incessant jabber in Dutch. The one who held the reins looked good-natured enough, but the other, whose duty it was to wield the enormously long whip, had a most diabolical cast of countenance, in which cruelty and doggedness were both clearly depicted. We found his face a true indication of his character before the end of the day. Bumping gaily along, we soon left the well-built houses behind, and after passing the Malay quarter of the town, remarkable by reason of the quaint houses these blacks make out of paraffin tins, flattened out and nailed together with wonderful neatness, we emerged on the open veldt. Of course the road was of the roughest description, and sometimes we had to hold on with all our might to avoid the concussion of our heads with the wooden roof. In spite of this, as soon as the Kaffirs saw an open space before them, the huge whip was cracked, and away went our team at full gallop, seemingly quite out of control, the driver leaning back in his seat with a contented grin, while his colleague manipulated the unwieldy whip. The tract ran parallel to the Rand for some distance, and we got a splendid view of Johannesburg and the row of chimney shafts that so clearly define the reef. On passing Langlaat village, we were stopped by a party of Boers who had off-saddled by the side of the road. As they were fully armed and their appearance was not prepossessing, we expected to be ordered to alight while our conveyance was being searched. However, our fears were unfounded and they were most polite. The driver muttered something in Dutch, whereupon the leader came to the door and said in broken English, "Peek Nikai, see all right." I am sorry to say one of the gentlemen,